All right, welcome guys. I got Thomas Jockin with me. We're going to be talking about the body. A good bridge because I think once we get to like Levinas, uh, then he starts using the body as demand, which I think is a really good twist, which I really like because, and even like Todd McGowan, he used death drive as demand. Now the problem is we're still gonna have a couple problems with that, but I'll just give like a kind of like I don't know if you know too much about Levinas, so I'll give like a kind of brief recap. And I only know like very little because I read it through Simon Critchley's Ethics book. So Levinas is kind of like a Heideggerian student, except he pushes back on Heidegger and he says Dasein apparently never starves. That's his whole like critique. He's like, apparently Dasein doesn't starve. So Levinas's subject is a being that is pre-conscious, and is very like, how do I describe it? It's like very like phenomenologically embodied, meaning like it has a joy of life. It has a joy of living. It likes to live. But once it encounters others, it already feels the imposition, the demand to be responsible. And he kind of played like, there's a kind of play on like response hyphen ability.
Yeah.
Right. And you could say like the body has that demand, like a response hyphen ability, because it has sense abilities. So he's using the body as a way to say it is responsible for the damage that is done to it, and then it's also responsible for its persecutors. Now, I don't really like, I don't know the extent of that whole like, I don't know the extent to that second leap. Like, how is the body responsible for its persecutors? How is that subject responsible for its persecutors? But Levinas really does take a kind of like, I mean, obviously doesn't use the notion of the body, but it's a very like masochistic logic. And what's very interesting about this, which I like because Critchley calls it a masochistic logic, what I think is very interesting is I do think the body has a masochistic logic to it. And I do think that the body demands of us. And it's this demanding that and the body's like interesting because it's something that I think is always ethically involved. And like, even if we put aside the idea of nous, the body being ethically involved, just like on a phenomenological idea, just like the fact that it's present, like the fact that I can like block you from like going through a door, right? Like you can literally feel like the uncomfortability, right? Like you can feel the lack of mobility because I am blocking your way, right? Like I can be very present to you in my body. And yet, as the highest principle, you could say, I could sacrifice my body for you, right? Martyrdom. I could die for you. But like, the interesting thing is, I don't think this is like something that is like super cognitive, so to speak, like a head on a stick. I think this is more like a the body thinks kind of thing. And so I think one answer, or like, I think so far the best postmodern answer I've heard is something like a Levinasian kind of like demand, where it's because I am this pre-conscious thing that has an a priori demand because I am in a body. I have enjoyment of life. And because I have enjoyment of life, I also take away life by eating, by consuming things. So that means like I already have a responsibility for the other by the way that I consume, interact through my enjoyment of life. I still may not be perfectly portraying this subject very well.
No, there's some very interesting details about this. I mean, first of all, the whole point is, if you like, the most concrete example of the law of non-contradiction is that you cannot have two bodies in exactly the same place at exactly the same time. So it's actually the most concrete example of the law of non-contradiction being demonstrated to you. Oh God, who did this? Someone did a famous experiment, or not a thought experiment, about the law of individuals. Oh God, who was the thinker? My brain's blanking on it. But basically uses that exact argument. Two spheres that are exactly in the same place at exactly the same time must be exactly the same thing. They must be. But that's a thought experiment. But we both know, as you use an example of you blocking the doorway for me, my body can't go through your body now, can it? And in fact, actually, again, this is not my room. This is not my sphere of study. But think about, I mean, basically think of that sexual reproduction. There's a lot of psychological kind of interaction with the kind of unity that occurs in the conjugal act, right? Basically, of a unification of two bodies, even though they're obviously different, and the tensions that result from that, both successful and failure. So there's an interest. So I'm just bringing up the idea of like the concreteness of otherness being demonstrated by bodies existing is that's materially demonstrated. The other exists because the bodies exist. There's a separation, right? So that's already very interesting from that point of view. Now, you are correct to say, because I mean, Aristotle would agree to this, right? A body has different activities that are not always all. The language is the term is development that Aristotle uses, because he points out that the entire existence, reality of a thing is not present at the immediate moment of its conception. Right, it goes through a phase of development, which is nutrition, then sensation, then intelligence, right? For human beings. So the interactions of the nutrition and the sensational are there; they're acknowledged. It is true that generally it's argued that those are servants to nous, right? Intellect. It's supposed to, there are servants to it. And part of the argument is that, and this is actually the point from Aristotelian point of view, the forming of that nutrition and that sensitive powers are derived from form. So that would be the challenge. The argument being made is because it's, even from a biological point of view, your biological entity existence is dependent on a form. Your DNA structure, that's a form. Right. Right. It's not the other way around. It wasn't that the DNA form was because we're human beings. We're human beings because of that form, that pattern exists. They kind of paint that through. But it is true, it does. And that's the thing. It actually, that word in Lynchia is actually very important. So the telos of the body is to live. That's the point. So that's actually where so besides that critique or Aristotelian challenge on Levinas, what you're summarized, it is true that the body has a enactment of its telos, which is to live. That's very true. And the body has needs. And the general argument is actually, it's called the vital heat. The vital heat is the thing the body needs. In fact, that's what health works on. Health's actual focus is on what's called the vital heat. It's excess or deficiency in achieving of the mean. And it has a demand that must be there for the life to exist. But that's very much in the model of what's called material necessity. To borrow this from Aristotle in physics, the example he uses is a house must have certain material for the walls, a certain material for the roof. It must be certain materials. If they are not existent, they're not there, they're lacking, there is no house. But similarly, a house must have a hypothetical necessity, meaning it must, to be a house, it must have a certain arrangement, a certain form. So that matter must be arranged in a certain way. But definitely the minimum. And by the way, there's actually some language about what's called bios, right? Life actually has two modes in Greek for Aristotle, zoe and bios. The bios side is really interesting because it's the way of being for the entity. So this is where it's not the explicit definition of, say, a certain bird of a but it's the qualifications of a certain kind of bird that we find them in marshes, for example. It's part of the way of being for that animal. that is a demand for this. So the example, some scholars have talked about this, where a polar bear has to be in a polar environment. It will not do very well in a desert, right? There's a demand of the body, of the existence of this entity, its material existence of this entity, that has to be accommodated for. Otherwise, it cannot exist. And usually, and this is actually an interesting angle. I mean, the question of evolution where the Aristotelian accounts are questionable. It's murky and not really ironed out. There's a lot of cope in terms of how to address it. But a fair way to could try to read it is to say, if a substance ends up in an environment that it is not ideal for, it will try to fit to that environment. The environment will be a form, kind of a material demand on the form, and the form will probably do its best to try to accommodate it. Less fur, longer beak, right? Evolutionary responses. There were a hypothesis this be done at the local level, like an individual entity is going to do it. And it's certainly true that like you may individually change a little bit, but it'll be generationally. Usually the mechanisms for survival of the fittest. So a certain population, a certain subgroup is doing better to live in that environment than others, and it will be almost min-maxed away to go towards what's working in that environment. So I'm trying to be sympathetic about this idea of the body having demand. It's certainly true. The environment certainly has demand that life has to respond to. And because the body's purpose in telos is life, it needs to respond to that. So I'm just playing with these. So I could be sympathetic to these ideas.
So in addition to Levinas, and this is the interesting thing that's been postmodern has kind of turned to, right, where Aristotle would be nous. You basically point to there's a kind of uncanniness to nous because it's not an organ. And so there's a kind of uncanniness to nous. What has been done in postmodern philosophy is that uncanniness has transitioned over to the other, to the encounter of the other. Basically, like any postmodern ethics now is more like, if we solely cognize the other, we reduce the other, and we need to be able to not reduce the other. So we have to be able to encounter them in their uncanniness, right? Like really encounter them. And like, this is, of course, to be able to respond to like difference and whatever. So the kind of indefiniteness that is the human being. So it's really interesting that, just like to add on to Levinas, it's like not only there's the demand, but then also it's the responsibility of the other, but only also in the sense that you don't reduce the other to sort of cognitive hold that you have. So I'm noticing a really interesting difference here, which is, you have nous, which has its like own kind of uncanniness. And then you have the uncanniness is sort of switched over in postmodern ethics to like the encounter of the other. The other has an uncanniness to him, not the nous, not you could say, because I think they're probably still thinking like cognition in this case. But I'm just, yeah.
I think that this is a good. I appreciate you bringing this up, because the first thing I want to point out is that, the thing that's kind of when I said that shocking part about the anageia, the life is the anageia of nous, doesn't necessarily mean it's organic. It's just animals that have life. Like this is getting at like, where is life? That it's a revelation that when we see life, we're getting this revelation that there's nous. So that uncanniness is this kind of shocking sign that was ever present with you at all times.
Right.
So it's a kind of how does it put this? It makes, because like, here's the basic positing of the main issue here is how does this life come to be from inorganic matter? Like that's the basic problem. How do you get to the generation of life? from inert matter that does not have life. Again, the something from nothing problem,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, like, I generally find these ethics of difference is generally an operation of suspension of judgment. I've noticed a lot of people are not getting this point when I keep saying it over and over again as a general point. I think it's
Mhm.
incredibly fascinating as the modern stance has been to shut down the suspension of disbelief or just suspend belief. That's basically our modus operandi in terms of how we are to act in the world.
Mhm.
And achieve and aim for maximal potential, because enactment of judgment compresses, right? So,
Right. Mhm.
so ideally, the moral stance is to just never have judgment, abstain, withhold, delay judgment, because that compresses, and operate in the most maximal manner of potential. Like I think that's a very different kind of problem than saying, what is the nature of reality? So notice that's an area of judgment. I think ethics is an issue of judgment and action that comes from the judgment,
Right. 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 So that's
versus this question of what is the nature of reality itself, right? So as you said, like, this is the point from metaphysics to then draw out, well, then if life is the enactment of nous, and and things like, for example, virtue is the instrument of nous. To what does it do? It's to achieve life. It's to actualize life. So
Mhm.
when we are in virtue, we are more in actuality, and that means more life. And it's basically to kind of work through that. Thus, the project of not simple, and that's now is a larger step that even I
Mhm.
will say is not in Aristotle, but I build up from this, is the activity of beauty, when beauty becomes that ethics. Because simple goodness is not good enough to get to
Right.
really achieve actuality of nous in its full sense.
Right.
Beauty is the better approximator of that.
Right. I mean, it's interesting
Because
because, like,
I just want to, sorry, it's one note, just last note. I apologize. It's just that's very different from the question of withhold judgment and enters being in a state of absolute of just maximal potential. It's a very different orient, even on that question of going back to this operation of cognition, of
Mhm.
thought and action. When beauty, that's towards a good, versus beauty, which would be there's a very different operation about that.
Right. And, like, so, and this is where, like, I wanted to connect it to Todd McGowan, um, on his idea of the death drive. And I think this I have already told you some of this. Um, and it's going to be obviously interesting because I know you're not a fan of Kant, but he, like, uses Kant in this essay. But basically, he's saying that the death drive. Now, to explain the death drive, it's like this unconscious drive to basically undo ourselves, right? Like, me overeating, etc. People smoking cigarettes, all the ways that we sort of participate in harm without really consciously realizing it. Um, in a virtue sense, most of these things would be vices. That's what's interesting about it. Actually, in the Lacanian terms, jouissance is the compensation of pain as pleasure. So essentially, pain as pleasure, me compensating for the way my reality is going, is like, I had a really bad day at work, so I'm gonna just shop and spend like a lot of money. So that's a kind of jouissance. Like, I get enjoyment. I try to get enjoyment out of my pain, and so I do something in response. So, and it's funny because, like, in the Aristotelian or Aquinas, even, like, the idea of overspending, um, is it can be a vice.
It's well, specifically malice.
Malice.
Malice is actually captures that essence very well for Aquinas.
Okay, right. And so, okay, so now I've made some of the connections because, like, McGowan wouldn't call these vices, but fundamentally he says that the death drive makes possible our undoing, which it basically prevents any idea of utopia and stuff like that, but also makes possible the idea of ethics, like us being ethical. It makes possible. So it essentially comes down to this: two forms of self-destruction, which I find interesting. And what I have acquired from this, if I were to do like a one-for-one translation, even though it wouldn't be a one-for-one translation because the metaphysics would be completely off, what he calls, like he basically says Freud made a mistake. The death drive is not sadistic. The death drive is masochistic. So that means that the two forms of self-destruction are this. There's one form of self-destruction where we want compensation. We want some return on our efforts, whatever, satisfaction. The other one is you get satisfaction from the loss. You get no compensation. Actually, the loss itself is the compensation, is the satisfaction. So this is actually where I feel like McGowan has a very like interesting, because he says the person that is able to enact on the self-destructive form in which there is no compensation is the one enacting the universal. It's in line with the Kant's moral imperative, essentially. But to tie this into the body, which is kind of like where I've been trying to do my work on, is I think because of the body's needs, I think it's an inverse. I think it's a mistaken causation that when people say, when I eat food, I am having an exchange. But actually, I would say it's a masochistic logic, essentially. But I actually think what drives us is the loss itself, right? Is the hunger. It's actually the hunger that gives us satisfaction for eating or whatever. So it's the privation itself that gives us the satisfaction. It's also what drives us. I think the satisfaction is actually a byproduct of the very privation. The satisfaction is not guaranteed. And it's funny because like most people would say like, oh, well, if you eat something, it's guaranteed, like, you'll be full and that's so satisfactory. It's like on a technical sense, yes, but at the same time, we live in an age where I could eat something and I could be like, that wasn't satisfactory. Like, you know what I mean? Like I could eat something and it's not satisfying for some reason. Now we could say, oh, that's because, we're not starving for food. If I was really starving for food, then that would actually make my satisfaction. But anyways, I don't want to get too technical into that realm. The point that I'm making is generally satisfaction is a byproduct. And the reason why I want to say this is because when we look at the mystics and the body, what do they always say? They say, don't pay attention to the ecstasies that you receive in your prayers to God.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I think you can find this masochistic logic as an ethics in the body itself. It's just, it always gets it kind of gets misconstrued, essentially.
Okay. Because there's multiple angles about this I want to talk about. One of the first ones is a general. I mean, this is a big issue. This is from Kant, and so yes, I'm not a fan because of this. He's one example of many. The idea that when the person that struggles for virtue is somehow superior to the person who does virtue effortlessly and gets no pleasure from it. That's completely backwards. The stance traditionally has been the one who does virtue easily, readily, without difficulty, and actually, literally, it's how they're not even aware. Like they're not even aware of it. They're not getting any pleasure from it.
Right.
That is virtue, because
Right,
it's like the same of you breathing. You
Mhm.
just do it. It's not even anything like it's this. That's the logic. It'd be like a person who can't breathe well. We're not saying that just because they're struggling to breathe well that they're better. They're a better human being living in the sense of having versus the person who just breathes normally and doesn't make any intellectual thought about it or struggle or gets any pleasure from it per se. The language I've used from some religious scholars is the idea of the consultations that are spiritual cookies, that you're getting these cookies for certain religious dynamics. And that's always cautioned. It's like that's a gift given to you because you're basically a dog that you need to be. And that's interesting. You have to be basically modified by pleasure to go towards God. And that's the argument, is that you're getting these spiritual ecstasies because of actually your deficiency as a religious. The real religious would actually be able to go into these activities and actually, this is a very big part, is that the dark night of the soul is when you lose that. You get stripped away of all the pleasures, all the conciliations of the spiritual practices, and you're just left with a brazen soul. And you have to struggle through that, and it's actually one of the acts of a purification of the spiritual practices. So these are very valid issues, even in the spiritual practice. And the body is used. Like the first stage of it is just doing things like fasting just to become aware of God in the first place. We only become aware of God or have the religious spiritual activity through privation. That's the first one.
Right. And that's an interesting connection. Like, why? Because like that, there's something really uncanny in that. Like, to me, I mean, for a long time I've always taken that for granted, but like when you really look at it, like that's kind of weird. Like, why is it that I have to starve my body to encounter God?
The short answer is what a lot of religions would say, because you realize you're more than a body. That's the short answer. That's usually the answer given. It's like you have to realize you're not a body. You have
but the body has that logic, though. That's what's interesting. The body has that kind of thinking to it. And I guess what I'm trying to say is it's interesting that the body, to connect it to the death drive, is the very thing that can get in the way of itself, and also the very thing that makes possible something like the encounter of God, which is, in my opinion, perfectly corresponds to McGowan's death drive. But to give like an Aquinas Aristotelian kind of twist, it would be the will. It's the will. Well, actually, it might be intention. Well, I mean, that's complicated.
No, I would. Your instinct on will is right. I think right.
Okay.
Well, it's because the interaction of the will with the irascible, especially the irascible appetite, the things that are difficult and hard to obtain, but even the concusable in terms of your basic fasting and your struggles with it. These interactions, the fact that you become aware. This is the thing: is like when nous is aware, when the mind is aware of mind, to use that language. So when you're aware of what of the tension, that kind of self-reflection allows for spiritual awareness, because you realize, wait, there's something more than my hunger. Wait, there's something more than my affliction, whatever that is. That awareness of a larger context, by the very fact that you're thinking about it, that is a spiritual practice, or one part of it.
And that's actually what I interpret, in my opinion, as like the enjoyment and the loss. But I think people
to be cute about it, because the Aristotelian stance is to say, this actually relates to, you brought up like 2 hours ago, an hour ago, about martyrdom, because that's obviously directly correlated with body, because that's the point. You're saying you're giving up life. See, that's the key, right? That you are giving up life for something else. What Aristotle would say is that you're giving up life for the best. And he says, and especially when a person of virtue makes that choice to give up their life for some their country, a friend. It's saying that this is actually very rational because this person, while pained and giving up a life that's